So our next speaker is one of our dear yarn organizers, Naina Sharma. Naina's from New York, and her fun fact is that she is a professionally trained opera singer.
I didn't always like to cook. I didn't even really like to eat, which, for those who know me, will come as quite the shock. Growing up, I was this skinny little kid who would much rather be cartwheeling through the house or absorbed in a book. Then one day, when I was 9, after a fun day at the beach, I woke up with a rash on my face. When a doctor finally diagnosed me with lupus, full name systemic lupus erythematosus, or SLE for short, there were a lot of things I didn't know or understand. For a long time, actually. My parents did a really good job of shielding me from a lot of the realities of my disease so that I could have a normal childhood. I didn't know that the rash on my face was a sign that my body was attacking itself. I didn't know that UV rays, like the sun, were a trigger for my immune system to go into hyperdrive. I didn't know that I now had an autoimmune disease for the rest of my life because it's treatable, but it's not curable. I didn't know that I would now have to take medication for the rest of my life to curb symptoms like extreme fatigue, arthritis, hair loss, and organ damage. Here's what I did know. Beach days were at a minimum now, long sleeves and hats in the summer, and most of all, I was really hungry. The medicine I was taking had revved up my metabolism, and all of a sudden, all I could think about was food. When you're thinking about food all the time, you start to think about more than just getting full. You really start to think about the intricacies of food. The nuances of sweet, salty, bitter, sour, a satisfying crunch, a slippery chew, the interplay between scent and taste. Food became interesting for the first time. It was complex. It was curious. Now, I love my parents a lot, but neither of them is a great cook. So if I wanted to explore these curiosities and cravings, I had to take matters into my own hands. So I began to cook. A few cookies here and there, an attempt at churros that nobody in my family speaks about anymore. But as I began to cook more, I wasn't just filling my stomach, I was bringing order to my life, feeling that freedom of experimentation when all I felt at the time was restrictions. And as I learned more about flavors and ingredients, I became more confident. I became more creative. Here's the thing with cooking. People think you need to follow a recipe. But the trick is that once you know the rules, you know how to get around them to write your own recipe. So this kind of focus on what I could do instead of what I couldn't do extended to other areas of my life. I couldn't really go to your traditional summer camp. It was too outdoorsy for me. But it's cool. I went to circus camp instead. I learned how to trapeze. I learned how to tightrope walk. I studied opera. I learned how to dance. I had a childhood full of exploring and growing and learning. Cooking was my form of self-expression, but I also realized that it was a form of connecting with others. So as a form of self-expression, when I had a bad day or I was stressed, it was this meditative, therapeutic experience that allowed me to focus solely on the act of creation and really allow those thoughts and feelings to work themselves out in the back of my head. And from one of those first batches of cookies that people actually ate, I realized that there was a joy in giving happiness to others. And cooking allowed me to express that. Food is so visceral, you know, we all need it to survive. And maybe that's why I always felt that thoughts and emotions were conveyed particularly strongly through food. So cooking became my way of showing empathy, joy, celebration with my friends and family. Now, I am very lucky. For most of the 18 years that I've had lupus, I've been relatively stable. From the age of 12 to 23, the biggest flare-up I had was at the age of 17 when, after a summer of too many pool days and open sunroofs, I just gotten my license. I got a rash on my face again, and most of my hair fell out, which, to be honest, was way more traumatic because I was a teenage girl in high school than it was a scary medical experience. The blood tests every month, the medicine every day, they were pretty much routine at this point. The long sleeves and the sun hats in the summer, it was second nature. It was often easy to forget that there was anything really even wrong with my body. And this is partially, in large part, because my parents growing up took on a lot of the constraints of my body. So I always felt like my constraints were external, not that they were part of me, that my body was fighting against itself. You know, it was my mom who was telling me, you can't go outside today, or don't you think this circus camp is cooler than that other weird camp that you want to go to? And so it was easier to forget. In college, I was particularly forgetful with that, you know, away from the supportive, guided environment of my parents and feeling that freshman freedom. I drank the way any college kid does, which on my medicine was downright dangerous. I pushed myself with unhealthy habits and late nights. I was still cooking. I was definitely still focusing on what I could do instead of what I couldn't do. But the problem is, there is a difference between being creative with your constraints and pretending that they don't exist at all. So 2 years after college, it all caught up to me. Stepping out of the shower one morning, I noticed that my feet were a little swollen, and they felt a little funny, like they were a water balloon. I figured it was just a hot shower and went about my day, but as the day went on, my feet became more and more swollen, and like my shins too. A trip to the doctor confirmed that my kidneys had stopped working. This was a hard dose of reality. For all these years, you know, I'd been pretending that everything was fine, that I could do anything. And this was a stark reminder that, again, I could be creative with my constraints. I could find ways to not push up against them, but I couldn't pretend they weren't there. For the first time in my life, lupus wasn't just an inconvenience. It was life or death. So I stopped drinking. I overhauled my diet. I became more thoughtful about balance in my life. I didn't push myself to run that extra mile or stay out that extra hour if I was feeling really tired. I began to do yoga. I began to meditate, incorporate spirituality into my life. And once again, cooking allowed me to refocus. Only this time, seeking the therapy of cooking without having food pile up in my kitchen and in my stomach. I found myself at a soup kitchen once a week on a corner in Manhattan. Cooking had always helped connect me to my friends and family, but now I found that it helped me to develop a broader empathy as well, to step outside myself. No matter what health issues I was going through, every week I was reminded that a stroke of luck separated me and kept me on one side of the serving table instead of the other. How I had received access to the best care my entire life that allowed me to thrive despite my circumstances. Opportunities I often took for granted. That was the year I really stopped to think about the impact I was having at my job, in my life, and what I wanted that impact to look like in the future. How I wanted to take advantage of all those opportunities in front of me and use them to continue creating and exploring. That was the year I decided to apply to Sloan. In the weeks leading up to Sloan, I was pretty anxious. I was worried that I was going to push myself in all the wrong ways and that I wasn't going to fit in. I just spent 2 years balancing myself on really understanding my body as an adult. I was worried about going back to a party atmosphere and a college atmosphere and drinking and especially meeting new people. I was worried about not going on a pre-function. They were all too sunny for me. But like, they were supposed to be where you made your lifelong friends. I was worried. And one night, it just became too much for me, and I broke down crying to my mom. I just kept asking her, what if? And then, it's not fair. I was expecting, some sympathy, a hug, for her to tell me that it was all going to be okay. Instead, she looked me straight in the eye, and she said, tough shit. My tears immediately dried up. She said, this is your life, so what are you going to do? Keep moving. It was the kick in the butt that I needed, and the next day, I organized an alternative pre-function for all of those who hadn't signed up for one, which, as it turned out, was a lot of people, which included a party at my house, and I definitely did some baking for it. And of course, as soon as I got here, I realized how inclusive and supportive this community is, and all of the opportunities there were for me to do more and be more in this place of infinite possibilities. So why am I sharing this yarn with you? First, I felt guilty for constantly forcing other people to share and not sharing myself. Second, I guess as you can tell from the story, I don't really like to define myself as somebody who is a patient, has an illness. I like to be much more than that. But it obviously has very profoundly affected the way that I live my life and the way I view myself and others, and I wanted to acknowledge that. Also, this is just a blanket explanation of why I A, don't drink, and B, look like a crazy 50-year-old on her Eat, Pray, Love adventure every summer. And finally, your limits are only as constricting as your actions. If you try to follow a recipe and have none of the ingredients, it's obviously not going to turn out okay. Instead, look at the ingredients you have and try and figure out what you can make with them. In other words, don't define yourself by your limits. Instead, find ways in which you can be limitless. For me, that's cooking. It is being there for my friends and family and classmates. It is taking full advantage of the resources here and figuring out how I can use them to make an impact in the future. And it's running this yarn.